and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Business Line Leader and Director of our Global Medical and Laboratory Business here at Intertech. And today I'm so excited to be joined by Claudia Sirch, one of our regional chiefs, one of our chief engineers, our subject matter experts in the laboratory and medical space. So Claudia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Claudia Sirch. I'm a chief engineer in Intertech Global's engineering team. I'm also the head of the ECA technical team, and I'm also an IEC technical assessor and lead assessor, and I'm active in standards committee work, which also includes IVD devices.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to chat about IVD devices today. I think, your background working in the technical space in the labs, your participation in committees and all of these different kind of areas have given you a lot of experience, of course, but also really interesting perspective on these types of devices, especially as we see, IVD type products becoming more popular and also getting more complex, right? I think with the pandemic and everything that we've seen in this push towards IVD type products, we've seen a change ourselves, right, in the labs and in the products that we're seeing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the trends that you've seen either personally in our own labs or with what you've seen from the committees, just as these products have kind of evolved over the last few years, especially with the pandemic.
Yes, so what we can definitely say that we've seen an increase in IVD devices submitted to us for testing, certification. And I suspect this is not only because of the COVID pandemic or because of the aging population. I think this is simply because we're moving away from this traditional healthcare model. So years ago, we went to see a doctor only when we were feeling sick or we thought something is maybe wrong. But nowadays, we're using available diagnostics to detect diseases at an early stage. And we also want to prevent diseases to break out. So from what type of devices have we seen lately? So definitely more devices for point of care testing, which are devices that are used at or near the site of a patient. So a typical example here is the COVID-19 test kit, which all of us I bet has used, various times in the past and maybe also in the future. So these devices are all, or they should be small, easy to use, provide fast results. And the topic that becomes more important here is also usability of such devices. And in line, what we see in other industries like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, all of that is also being incorporated into the IVD technology. So nowadays, patients want to be connected to the medical data, right? So they want to use an app on their smartphone and access their data with the help of these devices. And another, different kind of device, which we've also seen much more often now, are fully automated systems. So these huge laboratory analyzers, and some of them even incorporate robotic functions. And what they provide is they can test a lot of samples in a very short time frame. So that's pretty much, the trends that we've seen in our labs lately.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too. I was at a conference recently and they were talking about all of these pieces of IVD equipment and just what a booming market opportunity this is, and exactly what you said, right? Which is now people want to be able to test not only for an illness or something that you have that's plaguing you right in this instance, but also looking at, can we test for chronic diseases in that way, right? Can you look at even, larger type concerns and prevalence by using these type of home test kits? And then, the point you make about the consumer, right, with having everything at your fingertips, like maybe people are more willing to test for something at home in the comfort of their own home than having to go to a doctor or a lab and go through that. A lot of people have medical anxiety or anxiety about doing those things at a provider versus having to do that, in the comfort of your own surroundings. Yeah. So one of the things that I think is, really interesting about the IVD space too, right? So with medical, it's very clear how it's regulated. We also see that some IVD products, right, require special approvals or registrations for certain regulatory authorities or geographies. typically we're able to use standards to be able to demonstrate compliance for these and to make sure that we can, have a file that's complete and able to show that you're in compliance. With IVD, can you give any guidance on, how you choose the right applicable standards, how those standards are applied for these types of devices, knowing that you oftentimes will need this information to register?
Yes, so we get a lot of questions, which standards to use, does the standard cover everything really? And well, we can say that selection of standard has to be made very carefully. And what I always tell our clients is, you start with the definition of the intended use. Yes, we know it's intended for IVD purpose, but there could be different environments where this equipment is used. You mentioned earlier, at home, a lot of people want to use equipment at home. So there are devices which can be used at home, but they could, in some cases, they're used by a professional operator, somebody that's trained, or an instructed person. But sometimes the operator is just you and me at home, right? We're not trained persons, so. And even children are using these devices nowadays. And then also the question needs, is there other pieces of equipment or other items being connected to that equipment? And additional questions need to be used, to thoroughly define the intended use, because that's very important to be able to define the applicable standards or requirements. And then you mentioned, the target countries. So obviously we have different regulatory requirements in all of these target countries. So manufacturers, they really should define at a very early stage which countries they intend to export their equipment to. And in these countries, there's, as you mentioned, there's regulatory bodies. They have specific requirements, and they're typically pretty good at, providing guidance on the internet, for example. So you can find, for example, log onto the FDA website, and then you will get a list of recognized consensus standards. That is a good starting point. For the European Union, the standards that are listed as harmonized under the IVD regulation or other directives that may apply. And we shouldn't forget that there's an expectation of the regulatory bodies that the manufacturers have to demonstrate also compliance with state-of-art requirements. We have to say that some of the standards, they may not be exactly representing state-of-art anymore, because they have been written, developed maybe years ago, even in some cases decades ago. So we can also recommend that manufacturers do a thorough research. There may be, there may be studies or other documents that may be available to make sure that all these documents have been considered before even starting with the design of such products. Also, you mentioned devices are becoming more complex, and that's actually a very good point you brought up, because that also means that there may be new technologies or complex technologies incorporated, such as lasers. So all of a sudden, the IVD device becomes a laser product, where laser standards such as IC 60825 series may have to be applied. Robotics, I mentioned earlier. So we may touch the topic of functional safety, and so on. So all that needs to be considered with the overall goal to minimize the risks as far as it possible. Risk plays definitely an important role. So
that's a great thing that you bring up. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because I think on the medical side, people are really used to a risk assessment type model, right? A risk-based standard. But now when we see these types of products on the laboratory side, you're also requiring a level of risk assessment and risk analysis.
That is true, and I think we will talk about that a little bit later in more detail. But that brings me to some standards I wanted to mention here. And the first one definitely be risk assessment. That's one of the most important standards to consider. that would be the ISO 14971, for example, as one risk assessment standard that could be used. And once you do the manufacturer do the risk assessment, that will lead us to the choice of specific other standards, such as for quality management systems like the ISO 13485. And then safety plays a very important role. We not only want to make sure the operator is safe, but also everybody in the surrounding area. So for IVD medical equipment, we would, it's the 61010 series that we are talking about. But for self-testing devices, for example, there's other standards available. There's ISO standards, EN standards, and so on. Then software. Is software safety critical? Yes, no. If yes, then maybe 62304 may be a possible standard to use here. And I mentioned earlier, usability becomes more important, especially for these home use devices. And then we are, then standards like 62366 series may be the logical choice of being applied. What else? EMC, yes, EMC.
Yeah.
Electromagnetic compatibility. So there's a specific standard for that. That's the IEC 61326-2-6, I think. And in some cases, it can also make sense to use the medical collateral standard, like the 60601-1-2, when this is used in a hospital setting, or even if it's used at home. So
and I think it's interesting that you bring that one up specifically, because we have seen some instances of these types of products, right, when they're going to certain regulatory agencies who then come back and say, yes, we understand you tested to the safety set of 61010 standards, but we wanted to see you test to the 60601-1-2 EMC medical standard for these types of products, because they want to see that level of detail and information. So it is really important, right, to understand the kind of changing regulatory landscape, what your target geographies are, and match the standards to where you're trying to go.
Yes. And one very important item that I probably should have mentioned in the very beginning when we talked about standards is the performance aspect. So because IVD devices are used, basically we are making a diagnosis based on the results of the IVD product. We need to make sure that the manufacturers also use or take into consideration performance standards. So talking sterilization, microbiological methods, and so on. So this is a very important aspect to consider. And then in addition to that, I think I mentioned all the important, I touched all on the important areas, but there could be additional standards that labeling and so on. So I think there's plenty more.
Yeah, and I think there's one standard, and maybe we could talk just a little bit more about the 2-101 specifically, the 61010-2-101, and knowing, typically when do we apply this specific safety standard for IVD equipment? Like what is the justification for applying the 2-101?
Well, then we need to look at the scope of the standard, right? So the scope says that it covers electrical equipment that is used for IVD medical purpose. And it specifically says that it also includes self-test IVDs and also includes equipment that's for use by laypersons in a home environment. So which means non-professional users that we talked about earlier. What it does not cover, though, is handling or manipulation outside of the equipment, and also not the performance aspect, which we mentioned earlier. And this is why we have to consider additional standards to cover these aspects. And then we'll talk about the -201 specifically. It is not a standalone standard. It's a standard that is a part of the that's a part in the 61010 series of standards, a standard series that is used globally, that has been adopted and published as a national standard in many countries. So it's called a particular standard, and in that series of standards, and the whole series, it actually has a huge scope. It covers laboratory measurement and control equipment. So we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, of course.
Later on, talk about specific risks and how to apply the standards. So this particular standard is used in conjunction with the part 1, and it is used in conjunction in a way that it supplements or modifies requirements of the general standard of the part 1 standard, with the intention to cover the specific risks that we have to consider for IVD devices. And once again, I mentioned the intent of applying, these two standards together is to ensure that the risks to the operator and also the surrounding area are reduced to a tolerable level. So together, they cover hazards such as electric shock, mechanical hazards, excessive temperatures, radiation hazards. We measured lasers, before. Hazardous substances, explosion, implosion, and so on. And sometimes what is forgotten sometimes is that the standard also talks about hazards arising from reasonably foreseeable misuse and ergonomic factors. And what we also shouldn't forget, because some manufacturers tend to forget that there could be other particular standards that may be applicable. Going back to our huge laboratory analyzer with the robotic functions, with the lasers incorporated, that type of device may also include heating function, heating of materials. It may include a centrifuge, in which case you would have to apply 2 more particular standards, the -2-10 for heating of materials, but also the -2-20 for centrifuge. So, and this is why, I'm coming back to the intended use, risk assessment, and so on. So once we know that, once we had a look at the features of this, the IVD device, the technologies incorporated, this will then determine the parts to use within 61010 series, but also beyond.
Yeah, and I think too, a lot of what you're talking about pushes back to that idea that we speak a lot about, which is the early preparedness, right? And understanding what's required from a regulatory perspective, the country you're trying to go to, also all of the other things you mentioned, right? Understanding markings and labelings and having all of that ready to go up front and getting ready early and getting involved early to make sure that you're meeting all of the requirements. So with some of these specific standards in the 61010 series, especially related to IVD, are there things that we could do early on, or things that manufacturers should be considering earlier on in a design phase? I mean, you mentioned quite a few of them in terms of the quality management and things like that, but anything else you can think of or tips that we can give?
Yeah, so when we specifically talk about IVD devices and the risks that really go beyond the other risks, like electric shock hazard, that really applies to all types of laboratory devices, then we want to think about what are the specific risks that this standard covers, which is basically exposure of hazardous or to hazardous chemical substances, also aerosol vapors, radiation, and flammable liquids. This you may not see in, other types, not necessarily see in other types of laboratory devices. And the standard writers have done the job for the manufacturers already. They've specified some risk reduction measures to minimize these specific risks. And there's risk reduction measures they use here are markings, documentation, and a few constructional requirements they included in the standard. So I want to give you a few examples. So for markings, let's start with markings. So a lot of these IVD devices used in a laboratory on the bench type devices have a sample zone, right? And that sample zone, there's moving parts, which means there's mechanical hazards present. And if somebody, touches that zone, then which is not really intended, but it could happen, then there's a probability of a human skin being punctured. And if we are now, talking about samples that may be biohazardous, that is definitely a risk to the operator. But in this case, it may not be possible to make or to have an inherently safe design, like a constructional protection incorporated. So the standard writers considered in this case a marking to be applied, the biohazardous symbol to apply the vicinity or very close to the sample zone to warn the operator. And the same marking then also being necessary for containers of biohazardous waste material, also drain connections, biohazardous drain connections, and then also the caution symbol that is required here for equipment that can be hazardous due to the use of such hazardous substances. Then examples for instructions. Obviously, it's very important to give instructions for the responsible body so they can safely install the equipment and take all necessary measures that are important for having the equipment later on be operated in a safe way. So once again, we're talking about containment of hazardous substances, other protective measures related to hazardous radiation, mounting instructions, assembly instructions, how to, what are the necessary supply connections. And then, obviously, we have to provide, manufacturers have to provide instructions for the operator. So they have to describe how to safely use the equipment. This is not really unique to IVD devices, it's also to other devices. What is unique here is that the operator may have to be pointed to specific risk where they have to take additional precautions. Once again, because it is not possible to reduce the risk with constructional features. So maybe it is required for a specific device that the operator wears, nose protection, eye protection, mouth protection. Also, some additional measures have to be taken to ensure no injury occurs due to flammable liquids or, burns from surface. How to handle the hazardous substances in a safe way. So that is very important. And then from a constructional point of view, as I said, it may really be difficult to make the equipment safe in a way that no markings or instructions are required. So there's only a few requirements in the standard that apply on top, in addition to the general standard requirements. One is for over temperature devices, protection devices. In self-test IVD devices, and they cannot be self-resetting. And then also standard writers allow an alternative approach for interlock systems where function safety standards can be applied. That's pretty much it. Obviously, there's more in the standard, but that's something which I would consider important for manufacturers to be aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a lot to consider, right, on the front end in areas that you can be helping to mitigate risk. And I think, one of the other things you mentioned, we talked a little bit about, right, was this idea of a risk management file or a risk assessment file. You mentioned it earlier, we talked about it briefly, but, with medical, we see manufacturers filling out, checklists that we provide and supplying this information. Do we have a similar process on the IVD side if you're submitting an IVD risk assessment? How does that work when you're submitting to a test house with an IVD type product?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So when it comes to risk assessments, you really need to read the standard very carefully. So what does the standard say? So it says that risk assessment shall be carried out and documented using requirements of ISO 14971. We mentioned the standard earlier.
Yeah.
But for hazards that are not addressed in the part 2, like the 101, and in the general standard. So I think there's a slight difference here to the 6 or 601 standard. But now manufacturers will start asking the question, well, this is why is that requirement in there? Because, isn't the standard supposed to address all the risks? And didn't I tell you that too, earlier? Yes, that is true. But the requirement is in the standard because, as I also mentioned earlier, the standard, when it is published, it may not be, completely state of art anymore, because there may have been new applications which emerged, which standard writers may have not thought of when they started developing the standard. And also, I mentioned the standard scope is very broad. So it covers really everything from a tiny little COVID test kit to large automated systems. And this is why, not all hazard and specific risks may, be included in the standard when it is being published. So if we think about it, the risk assessment requirement in the standard really serves two different purposes. So first, to identify, do the requirements in the standard in fact cover all the hazards and the risks? If they do, like, for example, electric shock hazard, then manufacturers don't have to reinvent the wheel and do risk assessment and so on, because the standard has already requirements for construction, for markings, for documentation, and also the standard includes tests to actually confirm that these risk reductions actually work. But if the manufacturers then, by doing their risk assessment, come to conclusion, no, hold on a second, there is a hazard that is not maybe adequately addressed here, then risk analysis and risk evaluation need to be completed. And once again, I think I repeat myself, but the start of any risk assessment is, once again, the definition of the intended use, including reasonable foreseeable misuse, as specified by the manufacturer. Then, when the manufacturers go through that, they will come to a conclusion, is the risk in a tolerable range or not? If it's not, then appropriate risk reduction measures have to be implemented. And then also the effectiveness will have to be verified. And all of this needs to be properly documented. And that has to be provided to the test house for review. This is really not different from what's required in the, like the 60601 standard, for example. And what would somebody like me, like the test house, then look for? Well, we look for evidence in the documents that the risks have been eliminated. Well, eliminated is, it may be, so let's say reduced to a tolerable level. And then we will also check or look at how the manufacturer have verified that the risk control measures have been, effective.
Yeah, I think, Claudia, I think that's such a good point for us to end on too. I think the documentation piece is something that sometimes gets forgotten about, and it's just how it's documented, right? Making sure everything is properly documented. That's something we see a lot, and an area where we see people sometimes, have missteps, right? Is in how the documentation is actually collaborated and documented together. So such an informative discussion. Really appreciate all of the good insights that you provided. If anyone has questions or additional clarification that they need, please feel free to reach out to us directly. Thank you, Claudia, so much for joining today. It was wonderful to have this discussion with you, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thanks, Clarissa. Thanks for having me today.